this is the title, and you're probably wondering what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about all kind of things, all kind of words in that title. So it's going to be like overview talk. And I will start with introductions to identity, to wallets, to threshold cryptography, and then I will go on with our solution description. So let's get started. But before that, just a short introduction, who I am, where I'm coming from, what's the context here. I'm coming from a private research and development company. Oh, that's not the correct slide. So, the talk is based on actual academic paper, and I can't take credit for that, but I'm going to talk about application of that paper. So, now, the company introduction. We are a spin-off from Estonian Academy of Sciences. We have done information security, digital identity, and e-governance solutions. And we would like to say that we are the architects behind the eEstonia. We are a multinational company by now already. We have offices in Estonia, but we also have a small presence in Czechia as well. Now, let's go on with the introductions. Overview. What is digital identity? I suppose that there are a lot of people from outside of Europe here, and therefore, let's talk about what government issued digital identity means, or what it used to mean in the old days. So, what we used to have. Every country used to have a population registry. You have globally assigned identifier to all people. You also have smart cards with long-term key pairs and long-term certificates. Those certificates tie together your identity and key pairs. And you can do all kinds of things with that. You can do authentication, you can do digital signatures, you can do decryption and encryption as well. Okay, so that was the old days. But it's still functioning these days as well. It's actually a well-functioning system right now as well. What's been updated since last year is that now we are going to have wallets. So wallet is an app that is running on your mobile phone, and you can have credentials in it. So it's going to be a little bit more difficult. You're going to have mobile driver license credentials. You're going to have digital identity credentials. You can have diplomas, all kind of proofs, things like that. It's a little bit based on self-sovereign identity concepts. It has many key pairs, so technology is different, but the underlying problem is still there. And I will come to that problem in a minute. At the same time, what's also been happening in the world is that private key management has become automated or more service-based. So if you think about it, in the old days, when you asked for a HTTPS certificate, you generated your key pair, and you went to a CA and you asked for a certificate. And that certificate was valid for 3 years. Now, certificates are going to be valid for 47 days. And you do that all that automatically. I'm really happy that the previous talk was also about building a CA. So, yeah. But at the same time, something underneath those certificates also have to manage the security, also have to make sure that only correct entity or correct server, correct person gets those certificates. So something has to be underneath things. Those turtles that you lie on top of each other, some things they have to rely on. And we as information security professionals, we should understand what's there. What is underneath everything? Okay, back to the original problem. You have a PKI for a country or self-sovereign identity system. with many credentials, millions. You may have millions of users. Where do your users store their private keys? All right, we have actually a couple of solutions already. Industry best practices so far. Smart cards, they work well. Yes, you can buy them, I don't know, $10 a piece. You can give them to citizens. You can do things with them. But they don't work really well with mobile phones and wallets. It's not very usable. Then there are Apple and Google services that also provide private key protection. You can use Android Strongbox, you can use iOS Keychain, and it used to be the problem that those kind of services, which are offered for free, based on a standard mobile operating system, those services were not certified, were not deemed to be secure enough for government purposes. This is going to change soon. Google is working very hard to provide certified solutions as well. So, in some sense, this problem might go away. But I have a nagging feeling that if I get something for free, then perhaps it's not the best thing. Perhaps it's something is still there. Perhaps there's going to be a trade war between my country and Google's country, and I get denied access to that functionality because of dual-use, military-grade export cryptography. I don't know. Let's see. We still have options. GSMA and Global Platform, they are working on eSIMs and SIM cards. SIM cards are basically small computers, like Java cards. Very good, okay. And eSIM is also like a small chip inside your mobile phone, which is an independent chip. It's a secure one. Very good. Global Platform is thinking that they can put an applet inside that chip, and they can give that applet, they can give control over that applet to a country, and you can put your keys in it. All right? Well, only thing is that there is no organization yet who will manage all kind of things. So Global Platform will still be the root, or the device manufacturer will be the root of trust. So there will need to be intermediary, somebody who distributes that trust to the member states, and somehow it has to work out. We don't know yet. And we are left over with remote HSMs. But that is a problem that it gives control to the service provider. Yes, HSMs are certified, they are secure, but in principle, service provider can do all kinds of things with your keys if they want. So you are giving away sole control. And sole control is one of the important things. What I'm going to talk about is threshold crypto. I quite like it. I think it's very neat. In the physical world, the equivalent is a safety box with two keys. You give keys to different people, and those two people have to come together to open that safe. In cryptography, in mathematics, it's possible to do the same thing. And it has been researched for quite a while already, starting from 1979, and almost when the PKI became a thing, the threshold PKI also was researched as well. It's getting serious. NIST has done standardization workshops. There has been open source implementation, there are standards. It's almost like a building block. And I would like to apply that building block to our digital identity systems now. What we have learned that works pretty well in practice is this kind of system where you have user, service provider as two parties. User has a knowledge factor that is also cryptographically bound to the shares. And user's mobile device has one share of a private key, and service provider has another share. And in order to do crypto operation, you need to have this knowledge factor. You need to have users share, and user have to access the service provider's share as well. So nobody can act alone. Nobody can do operations without having access to everything. And that's really cool, because there are interesting security properties that come up from that kind of system. It turns out that we have a protection against offline brute force, because this user's share is encrypted, and attacker cannot use it without a PIN code. All right? Online brute force, because every crypto operation has to do online query again, we can limit attacker. We can limit it to 10 tries, 3 times, 3 tries. We also have clone detection. We can detect when somebody is using exactly the same share. And we can achieve user sole control. Sole control is a pretty important thing from eIDAS regulation. And it actually ensures that user alone has control of the key pair, not service provider. Even so, yeah, service providers are audited, they are promised that they will behave, and so on. And with this kind of system, we are actually limiting the risks of service provider as well. We have actually an example of such a system. It's implemented, it's in practice, it's used in 3 Baltic countries, in Belgium, in Iceland. Just yesterday there was a news that Armenia is also trying out this kind of system. It's pretty good, and it uses exactly the same kind of idea. So this is the current situation. Now I'm going to talk about the future situations. Because this current situation is actually using RSA, which sounds pretty old, and nowadays everybody is talking about post-quantum cryptography and so on. I'm just giving you an overview of how simple it is from RSA point of view. You have those shares. They are created by additive sharing. User generates a key pair, server generates a key pair, and signing works just by multiplication. If you have studied cryptography, RSA textbook, it's amazingly simple, and it's tempting to try to use it for another situations as well. Okay, that was what we have at the moment, what is currently used in production, but what we are going to do about it. We don't have those old smart cards anymore. We have wallets, we have post-quantum cryptography, and so on. All right. I'm probably assuming wrong kind of audience, but can I get a show of hands? How many of you think that you are using already post-quantum cryptography? Almost every day. Oh, very good. Everybody raises hands. Very good. So I'm in good company here. So yes, post-quantum cryptography is a real thing. It's already used in practice. It's mandated by governments. United States NSA says that we should prefer signing with post-quantum algorithms even today, and we should use them exclusively by 2030. European Union is not so forward-looking, but the European Union also says that we should do something about it. And we are doing, yes. So it's a real thing. It doesn't matter if quantum computers are coming or not. It doesn't actually matter if quantum cryptanalysis is successful or not. Post-quantum crypto algorithms are coming anyway. And if we want to play along, if we want to communicate with the rest of the world, we have to go there as well. So it's inevitable anyway. So what's the current situation? Very good website. It gives you an overview how things are going. Internet important protocols, how are things going with that? Number 9 is the best score. Number 1 is the worst score. But those protocols don't include digital identity. So perhaps I should skip those slides. I suppose everybody knows what post-quantum cryptography MLDSA algorithm really is. Okay, let's not go into details here. But I would just like to point out one little thing is that when classical crypto algorithms work on numbers, okay, RSA works on numbers, like 1, 2, 3. Elliptic curve cryptography work on curves, so it's a little bit more complicated. They are funky mathematical objects. What MLDSA works on is actually polynomials. They are pretty long ones, and they are organized into matrices. So it's an awful lot of objects and a lot of computations to do with that. And I have to say that I'm not really up to speed here, so I will just assume that it works. But it's a nice thing, nice illustration. And those bold symbols here, they represent those matrices. So you have to do multiplications between matrices and you have multiple ones of them and so on. And also, new thing is that with MLDSA private keys and signatures, they are getting larger. They are kilobytes in some cases. Okay. So everybody believes that post-quantum cryptography is there. We have to deal with that. And let's figure out how we can do threshold cryptography with MLDSA. All right. So to start with, I will have to explain a little bit about what I mean by additively shared values. So let's say that we have two parties. We have client and server. So this is C and S. And additive sharing means that if we sum those values together, we get the original value. If we sum together shares this V in brackets C plus V in brackets S, and we do this addition in modulus of some kind of field, we get the original value back. But individual parties, they don't understand what they are computing with or what kind of values they are holding. And what is really interesting or really useful is that those parties, when they talk to each other, they can perform computations on confidential values without knowing the actual value of V. So you can do additions, you can do multiplications, and with that kind of arithmetics, you can build up your function space and you can implement more complex mathematics, more complex protocols, and you can actually do cryptography. Just to give you an idea how that works, here is an example of how addition works. So client has A, share of A and share of B. That's A in brackets C and B in brackets C. And server has corresponding shares. They don't know the actual value of A or B, but they want to compute A plus B. Well, they can add together their each shares. So they can add together A in bracket C and B in bracket C, and in the end, they have computed this addition. It gets more complicated with multiplication. It gets more complicated with other functions, because this one is a local function. You can compute it without any network interaction, any round trips. You can do it faster. But the good thing is that we can build up those more complex mathematics. And if we go back here, if we remember that we had to do those multiplications of matrices, and those matrices were composed of polynomials. So there's a lot of computation to do, but it's still possible. All right, let me go further now. There is one little problem here. It may be the case that client doesn't fully trust server, and the server doesn't fully trust client to do correct computations. So, and in case the client or server sends you a malicious value, and you do your computation, and you reveal the end result, it's called declassify. It may be the case that the malicious party can learn what was the confidential value in the beginning. Of course, you cannot do like stupid computations like multiply this confidential value by 1 and give me the result. That would be not good idea anyway. But even like proper, honest formulas, they can reveal something. So, in order to ensure that everybody is using like correct values, which are not maliciously modified, there is a research that uses something like message authentication codes. They are not regular HMACs, but they're using the same name. All right. So I don't exactly understand how that works, but our cryptographers say they understand it, and I was told that it's really, really useful, really necessary. So what they have come up with is that they need awful lot of random numbers, and they need to have those numbers generated in such a way that client and server gets a random value, get two random values, and it's correlated to each other, but they don't know what the other value was. So if we go to like a system diagram now, then we need a third party as well. So we need a third party that generates those technical random values, because phone is usually far away from a server, and network bandwidth is limited. We are using this idea of sending a seed value to the phone, and let the phone use pseudo-random generator to generate those additional values. But the server gets actual values. So what we can do is that client side, the phone, has private key material, Server side has its own private key material. They can do cryptographic computations with each other from the help of correlated randomness provider. And we still get all the same properties that we used to have for this RSA-based system. We still get user sole control. We still get offline brute force protection. We still get online brute force protection. So all the good things are still there. But we can do MLDSA signatures now. Okay? So how does it work? We have implemented it. We have done prototypes, multiple ones, in different languages, in different settings. Here are the initial results. So what we can do is generate keys, generate shares. It takes some amount of network traffic to do that. And it takes some time to generate all those things, because all those computations still need to take place. Okay, at the moment, half a second, and I don't know, kilobytes of data, megabytes of data. So this is the current cost of running such a system. Key generation itself is pretty good. Signing performance is also reasonable. 2 seconds for actually doing a signature. It's not too bad. It's possible. Network data from server to the client and client to the server is still under 1 megabyte. And this randomness provider has to send multiple megabytes to the server. Okay? So this is the current results. And yeah, the tricky thing about MLDSA is that sometimes you have to repeat the signing process, because sometimes it turned out that if you would reveal this signature, it would reveal too much of your private key information. So what we are actually doing here is that we are doing 3 parallel signing attempts together, and we are assuming about 30 milliseconds of latency between server and client. Okay. Now, to the actual topic. So we have threshold post-quantum cryptography now. And we will have wallets. So 2024, there was an announcement that European Union member states will have wallets. In 2026, at the end of 2026, they will have to do ones. They actually have to issue wallets to the citizens, and it all has to be in production. I don't know, how many of your people here, have you participated in any of the large-scale pilots, perhaps? No. Very good, very good. There's still time. There are new pilots coming up. So governments and companies, they are still trying to figure it out, how to do interoperability and how to do everything. So let's see what we would like to propose here. So first of all, what is this wallet thing at all? I mean, we have a mobile app. It's inside user's device. And what European Union smart people have come up with, European Council smart people, and also smart people from other expert groups, is that we should have something that is called Wallet Secure Cryptographic Application. WSCA and WSCD. You can think of this WSCD, this lower box, as your regular HSM. So this is actual hardware device that keeps users' keys in it and does cryptographic operations. WSCA is almost like a firmware or some application on top of it. And it does some useful things, like it does authentication perhaps, or something like that. So this is like a reference architecture or abstract architecture. And so there are following options. Options to actually implement this WSCA thing. So we might use local native WSCD. This is like Android key store, Android Strongbox. We might use local internal WSCD. This is like a SIM card inside user's phone. We might use a smart card as well, or we might use a remote HSM. Those are the options that are defined or explored actually in a regulation level. So it's not directly written into a law, but the Implementation Act, yes. So, and if you remember earlier, I also talked about what kind of options we have from technical point of view. Where can we store private keys at all? This list sounds pretty similar, or looks pretty similar. So that's interesting. So, what we are looking at is the last option, this remote WSCD option, remote device, HSM. So what we are doing is that we are implementing those kind of functions. Those are the lower level functions that WSCA has to provide to wallet internal components in order to participate in OpenID for VCI and OpenID for VP protocols, and mobile driver's license presentation protocols. Those are actually the cryptographic functions that needs to be there. In the old days, we used to just do sign hash, sign anything. This sign proof, it's actually the same thing, but we can call it with a new name. It's more pretty. All right. And we can distribute things now. So we can say that our client-side WSCA will have some part of the user's key material. We can say that the wallet provider will have randomness provider and server-side WSCA. And we are not fully sure yet. We haven't decided yet where do we put those keys. Is it inside this HSM thing or here, or whether this will be one box? It depends on the certification. And that's another topic that I will have to go through a little bit quicker. So, wallets. Everybody wants to trust wallets. How do you achieve trust? You test and you certify. You audit. And this is all in a law, that in order to ensure high level of trust, there has to be security evaluations. There has to be national certification schemes. And there is currently a work going on to come up with Nordic certification scheme and to come up with a pan-European certification scheme. What it actually means down there is that those components, if I go back, so those things, WSCA, SCD, those things, they would have to be certified against specific protection profiles. If you know a little bit about common criteria, protection profile is like a template document that says that this class of products have to implement those functions. They have to be secure against this kind of threats, and they have to implement those kind of security features. And every manufacturer then takes this template, explains how their product is implementing those things. And lab takes the product, takes the documentation, and verifies if this is actually true. What is the good news is that we have actually done that for our RSA-based product already. So we are more confident that we can do it again. Summary, and 3 more minutes. So what can you take away from this session? What should be useful to you? So first of all, and I would love to continue this discussion over coffee or maybe at the evening over something else. Protecting secrets inside users' application is pretty difficult problem, I think. If you think about secrets as a long-term secrets, if you think about secrets as something as ephemeral, something that only needs to be there for 1 minute or 1 hour, something like that, then it's a little bit different. But let's discuss that. However, I believe that threshold cryptography is a powerful tool here. And I'm lucky that I'm not alone here. I know 2 other companies in Europe who are doing this. I know 3 other research groups that are doing post-quantum threshold research. So this topic is interesting, it's active, it's going. I should recommend you to look at this space in the future. And we can report that we have first prototype for MLDSA. And for actual collaboration or standardization attempts, there are ETSI and CEN-CENELEC working groups that are trying to come up with technical protocols, are trying to come up with protection profiles, and technical collaboration work is happening there. I would be very glad to cooperate with interesting parties. So that's it. Any questions?
Thanks a lot. Thanks for a nice talk. I sort of have 2 questions. One might be pretty simple, I guess. The WSCA, WSCD, the design sort of that you showed, is this something that each European country will decide, or are you designing it for every country, or is it even like user, possible to be chosen by user, like what kind of setup I will go for?
So those architecture options.
Yeah.
Those options will be chosen by a specific wallet provider, and depending on the size of the country, every country will have at least 1 wallet provider. In some cases, it's going to be like a national one or government-operated one. In some cases, there will be multiple ones. For example, Germany will have a national wallet that is using this remote WSCD paradigm. They have published their architecture documentation, so on. In some countries, there is still tenders going on to decide who will supply those kind of things. So it will be up to each country to decide what is their favorite.
Okay, thanks. So that sort of reminds me the GCC during COVID era, and it was pretty wild with every country doing their own backend and frontend, but we'll see. Maybe quick second question. With the deployment of threshold crypto in Estonia for split key, etc., do you see, I'm sort of looking for the obstacles when deploying these solutions. Do the users, legislators, companies involved, like, are you able to get the message to them why threshold crypto is like different, it's orthogonal to the classical crypto or post-quantum, this is something else, we are protecting the private key? Do users or these people involved understand like the differences with like 2FA or something like that? or are there obstacles where you need to like continuously sort of sell the point of treasury crypto? What are the obstacles in this area, if there are any?
I think that there are a lot of obstacles, as with any kind of different idea. And I think that it's good that people are skeptical about it. And also, experts who are trying to decide on the merits of that kind of solution or other kind of solutions, they certainly do understand, and they ask good questions. So I would say that the end user itself doesn't know and doesn't care, but it's up to the regulator or security evaluator to understand if the risks are mitigated sufficiently and correctly.
Thanks a lot.
Yes, is there more?
We are unfortunately out of time, but for the folks who have questions, please connect with Mr. Kalu on the coffee break.
All right, we can continue. Thank you.